Hello, everyone, and welcome to DataOps for the modern data warehouse. Today, our speaker will be Ted Malone. He's a data and AI cloud solution architect in Microsoft's West region. In this current role, Ted engages with Microsoft's customers to evangelize and support the Microsoft data and AI story, and to educate them on new and exciting ways to gain insight from both unstructured and structured data within their environments, as well as incorporate Microsoft's suite of advanced analytics and machine learning capabilities. Prior to joining Microsoft, Ted was a software architect and in the CRO office for EMC, where he led the design and development of enterprise storage management solutions that leverage big data and complex business intelligence technologies. Ted is a data guy that has developed and deployed data insight solutions for more than 2 decades and has worked with Microsoft SQL Server since version 1. Ted has been a featured speaker at many industry conferences and events, including Microsoft's Federal Forum, Microsoft TechEd, Microsoft Tech Ready, Meritalk, AFCA, the Professional Association for SQL Server, Dev Connections, and many more. Ted, I'll hand everything over to you now.
All right. Well, thank you very much. I really appreciate your intro there, and I appreciate everybody joining this particular session. This is sort of a different session for me in the sense that normally what I would do is I have a presentation and we'll spend most of the time talking about the subject and then a little bit of time demonstrating about the subject. But what we're doing this time is this is really part 2 of a presentation that's the continuation of the last reactor presentation that I did before Christmas. And what we want to do really is spend more time in this presentation and in this session really going into the actual meat and of everything, if you will, the actual demonstration of what it is that we're talking about, to kind of give you some real, for lack of a better way of putting it, hands-on with respect to what we're doing with DataOps and particularly with the integration of Azure Data Factory and Azure DevOps. So for those that didn't attend the first session that we did here, it is available for download on the Reactor website, and I would suggest that you go in and download that to just kind of get a good idea of some of the theory that we're talking about here. And for those that don't know me, you can follow me on Twitter. My handle is here at Ted Malone, and also on LinkedIn. And if you want to ask questions after this is over, and if we don't get a chance to get to your question as part of this session, feel free to shoot me a note on LinkedIn. I'm more than happy to interact with you there from that perspective, or Twitter as well. Either way. The thing is, if you follow me on Twitter, you're gonna see a lot of my dog pictures, because I do tend to post a lot of pictures about my dog and other things there. But nevertheless, we'll just kind of jump right into it. And even though I said this is part 2, I know that there are some of you here that haven't attended the first session of this, so I will spend just a little bit of time here kind of giving a recap of what it is that we were talking about. So that's what we're going to do here today in this session. We're going to do a real quick review of what we've already talked about in the other session, and then we're going to kind of dive into the meat of this. We're going to talk about DataOps, specifically what it means with respect to Data Factory, what it is that we're doing with the Data Factory integration with Azure Data Factory. We're going to talk about the life cycle to just kind of remind everybody where it is that we're really focusing here. We're going to talk a little bit about how Git works in Data Factory, just so that we're all kind of in the right mindset when it comes time to really dig into what it is that we're talking about. And then we're going to do an end-to-end demonstration here where what I'm going to do is I'm going to take a pipeline that is created in a dev environment and show you what it is that we need to do to enable sort of the CI/CD process with that data pipeline with respect to Azure DevOps and what we need to do there. Once we go through that and kind of set up some of the things here, we'll talk about the best practices, and we should have a little bit of time left over at the end of this to get into some Q&A. But again, if we don't have time at the end, don't think you're gonna miss out if you do have questions. Again, I'm more than happy to interact with you on Twitter or LinkedIn from that perspective. All right, so let's go ahead and get right into it. So as a recap, when we talk about data ops or data operations, it's not just simply DevOps for data. It's much more than that. It really is the idea, it's a discipline that brings together the side of your organization that builds product and that handles all of those release pipelines and all of that fun stuff, together with the data engineering world that typically has been forgotten with respect to CI/CD pipelines and continuous integration and all of these things. A lot of times data really doesn't fit into that model. And so that's really what DataOps is trying to accomplish, is merging that mindset of CI/CD, continuous integration, continuous deployment, continuous improvement, the agile engineering, if you will, and bring it into the world of the data professional, the data scientist, the machine learning engineer, the AI operator, if you will, from that perspective. So it is much more than just figuring out how to do data with DevOps, from that perspective. From Microsoft's perspective, when we think about moving data or working with data or making data available for the consumers of said data, it's really kind of something that we do. There's really only boy, if I could talk, we'd be doing really good today. There's really only two tools in Microsoft's enterprise toolset today in the cloud environment that we really work with, either Azure Data Factory or from a more user-focused perspective, Power BI and data flows within Power BI. What I'm going to be focusing on here is the Data Factory tooling, but much of the concepts that I'm talking about, much of the things that I'm doing here will really apply also from a Power BI data flows perspective. And what you're going to see as the future, kind of comes into focus a little bit more, is you're going to see a merging of a lot of these tools from a data professional perspective. So we just want to kind of keep that in mind, but I did want to make sure that I set the stage here that we're talking about Data Factory as really the focus here. And if you're not familiar with Data Factory is Microsoft's cloud service that is effectively quote unquote code-free, low code, no code, ETL as a service, extract, transform, load, or extract, load, transform, either way that you're working with that. For the most part, if you are a data professional, most likely, if you're working in Microsoft's ecosystem, you're going to be using Data Factory as sort of that tool that is part of the ecosystem. Now, getting right into sort of the continuous integration and continuous delivery as it applies to Data Factory. And again, remember, I've spent a lot of time talking about CI/CD in the previous version of this presentation. So if I say some things that don't make some sense here, and you want a little bit more information in the context I'm trying to use them, please download the other presentation and refer to it. But as we get into this, when we talk about this CI/CD, continuous integration, continuous delivery in Data Factory, one of the key tenets that we're going to put out here is that only the developer is going to be interacting with your source code from your source code repository. And specifically, since we're talking about integration with Azure DevOps, what it is that only the developers are going to be interacting with code that is published or committed in your Git repository in the Azure DevOps. So because of that, what we're doing is we have multiple environments that we think about. And in my case here, I'm only going to talk about 3, but many organizations, as everyone I'm sure is well aware of, have more than just 3 environments. But I'm simplifying things in this particular case, talking about a development environment, a test environment, and a production environment. And in that particular case, whenever we think about the architecture that we deploy for this, we really have 3 separate data factories configured in Azure. So we'll have the dev data factory, we'll have the test data factory, and we'll have the prod data factory. And each one of those is defined for a specific use in terms of the persona, if you will, that it applies to. From a dev perspective, all of your developers, people that are effectively, and I really hate this term, but it's the term that the industry is really coalescing around, the people that are the data wranglers for this, people that are taking data and shaping it and making it consumable for the end user, for the consumer of the data there. So that's really where our dev environment is going to focus. And then the test environment very specifically applies to people whose job it is to make sure that what the developers are doing is correct. So, and a lot of times what we're seeing today especially is we see a lot of automation in the test environment. So the test data factory is really where all of our smoke tests are going to be, all of the different, poking of the data to make sure that it's correct and things like that. They're going to exist in the test environment. And of course, the production environment is your actual production environment, the data that is consumed by your users. Now, if you are a organization that is wrangling data, again, I hate that term, but that's what everybody uses. If you're wrangling data for your internal users, then your production environment is the database, if you will, and the environment that those users interact with. If you're an application developer and you're providing a database as part of your code that you're delivering, then your production environment is that environment that is shipped with your product, however that works there. And each one of these environments is set up from a role-based access control perspective as being separate. Excuse me. Now, one of the really key things here with respect to the CI/CD process with Data Factory is only your development factory is integrated with Git. Everything else gets its code from a respective pipeline in Azure DevOps. So if you can kind of look at this chart here, when we think about the Git perspective, our developers are working in various branches, they're doing their thing, they're creating the pull requests, they're getting published, and then from that published perspective, once that happens, it's triggering the pipeline in Azure DevOps, and then Azure DevOps is taking all of the artifacts necessary to support whatever it is that you just did from a publish perspective, and moving that into the pipeline and down the path, if you will. So that's where your release management comes into play, where DevOps is defining the release and then creating that release and deploying that release into the next environment. So in this particular case that I'm laying out here with my 3 environments, the developer commits the changes and publishes, and then DevOps takes what has been published in ADF, creates the necessary artifacts for that, and then deploys it into test. Once the QA folks have signed off on that, then DevOps takes the artifacts from the test environment, adds it into the pipeline, and then deploys that into production. And that's really kind of the workflow that we're talking about here. In order to implement all of that, what we do in Azure is we have a resource called the Azure Resource Manager, or ARM. And ARM has a template associated with it that defines everything that we're doing from an infrastructure perspective. So anything that's needed to make that code happen happens as part of an ARM template in Azure. And so what we're going to see whenever we set everything up from a data factory perspective is we're going to really focus on what that ARM template looks like and how we can use that template to affect our deployments into our other environments there. So one of the key things is that all of the editing that would occur, all of the changes that would occur, anything that happens will only happen in our dev environment. We will never allow end users to make changes, schema changes, or anything else in the prod environment. And when we think of things in those terms, all changes happen in dev, and then they flow through this release pipeline to get into prod. What we're doing is we're setting up an environment that allows us to catch any problems that might occur, assuming that our tests are good and things like that. So that's what we're going to be talking about here. That's kind of the process that we're going through here. So if you take everything that I just said and you simplify it into a picture, that's what the picture would look like. And yes, I know I talk too much. The picture is really simple here from that perspective. But this is exactly what we're talking about here. We're taking all of our developer collaboration, it's happening in our dev environment, and it's controlled with our source code environment. Everything that the developer does happens under the watchful eye of Git, if you will. And then once that's published, then everything moves out of that environment and moves into the Azure DevOps pipeline environment. And then we just take and move from dev to test to production in that particular case. Now, this picture makes it look simple, but let me tell you, this integration is anything but, you know, as simple as a picture would make it look here. And fortunately, I work with some of Microsoft's largest customers with respect to this particular picture. And I'm fortunate in the sense, I say fortunate because what that allows me to do is experience firsthand the challenges that our customers have in this particular environment and in this particular arrangement here. And so what that allows me to do is be able to put together sessions like this that hopefully will allow you to bypass some of the pain points that that people feel in this particular area. So how do we do that? Well, the first thing that we want to do is make sure that we understand that if we don't commit, no pun intended here, if we don't commit to using Git to its fullest, we're never really going to realize the benefits that we could get out of this particular environment. So if you haven't worked with Git before, and I'm sure everybody here has, but just to make sure we understand it, Git is our source control environment. It allows us to track our changes, audit the changes, revert changes that cause problems, save incomplete work. If you've ever used Data Factory that isn't integrated with Git, one of the biggest frustrations that people have is that once you start something, you have to finish it. There's no way to just simply say, well, I'll come back to it later. If you ever want to work with your tools, you basically have to continue all the way down a path or throw it away. And one of the nice things about integrating Data Factory with Git is it does give us that ability to save incomplete work and not have to worry about having everything in a ready to run process for that. In and of itself, that's worth its weight in gold if you spend much time in Data Factory. It also gives us the ability to have really nice collaboration with other developers. One of the nice things about integrating a Data Factory with Git is the fact that the code is all the same. So if you have one person editing a file and another person needs those changes, you don't have to coordinate the exchange of that. It's just sort of automatic in the tools for that. And I'll kind of show you what I mean by that when we get into the demo here. And the other thing that is very nice about Git integration with Data Factory, if you haven't set that up yet, is that it really does speed the user experience and the user interface up quite a bit, primarily because it doesn't have to validate everything to make sure that it's correct and right as it's going through. It only has to validate the things that are published from that perspective. So it's definitely for large data factories, large artifacts, it's a really good thing to ensure that you have your Git integration. So once we've committed to all of this, then really what we want to do is we want to talk about what we have to do in order to actually implement the release pipeline and the CI/CD capabilities here. And I will make sure that this deck is available here for everybody to download. And specifically at the last slide in this deck is a list to all of our docs and all of the things that I'm talking about here in this presentation for this. So there's nice links for everything in there. But what I'm going to do at this point is I'm going to jump out of the actual presentation here, and we're just going to get right into the code itself and the products themselves and what it is that we're actually doing here. Give the screen just a chance to catch up with me. So the very first thing that I want to do is I want to talk about sort of the Data Factory environment and specifically what it looks like whenever we integrate it with Git. Now, I'm going to say this up front. It should be pretty obvious, but I just want to make sure that I'm really crystal clear on this. The environment that I'm working with here is really simplified. I've kept it to a minimum of the things that we need to get the point across here. Obviously, you're going to look at this and say, well, there's not much there. So of course it's going to be fast. It's going to be easy, things like that. The idea here is that what we're doing is we're talking about the things that are the minimum requirements to do what I'm talking about here. So with that in mind, everything is going to be pretty minimalist with respect to what we're looking at. But let's just kind of start off here from the very beginning. If we take a look at the Data Factory environment, really, if you haven't seen it, this is the user interface for Azure Data Factory. It's really straightforward for that. We have over on the left-hand side, we have the things that we're working with, whether it's going to be sort of the docs at the landing page, if we're going to author, work with our pipelines, work with our data sets, work with our linked services. if we're going to monitor pipeline runs, things that we've already had going, or if we're going to manage, configure, set up the environment here for everything. So what I'm going to do here is I'm actually going to go into the author environment for this particular data factory. And this data factory is my developer data factory. And so because of that, what you'll see in the upper left-hand corner here, you see that it is integrated with Azure DevOps, and specifically looking at Azure DevOps, and for this repository, it is working in the master branch. So in my case, with what I'm working with here with a simple environment, the master branch is my collaboration branch. This is the branch where I have all of my developers check in all of their code and everything too. For most organizations, the collaboration branch would be something that was off of the master, and master is kind of like your mainline code for that. But as I said, we're going to just keep it really simple here. So my master branch is my collaboration branch. Now, what I can do here if I want is, as you can see, I can, from the master branch perspective, I can create a new branch. I can change branches for my collaboration, or I can create a pull request in Git, which would say, hey, I've got some code that I want to merge into this, and I want you to approve that in this particular case. So we'll stick here in the master branch, and we're going to work with a very, very simple pipeline. And all this pipeline is going to do is effectively look at a database that I've got configured. It's going to figure out what the high water mark in that database is based on the last date that we have available in the database. We're then going to set a variable in our pipeline, and then we're going to use that variable in order to create a request to a web service, and we're going to go communicate with that web service, and then we're going to grab the data that we need, and then we're going to put it into a file and send it into our data flow for transforms. It's a really simple process here, and the mechanics of what I'm doing here really aren't important for that. But it is, again, very simple. And each one of these boxes that you see here on the screen, if you're not familiar with Data Factory, basically what it is it's just backed by a series of configuration options. And at the end of the day, whenever you look at everything, it all just exists as a big JSON document for everything. So for example, here's that last date variable. I have some information about it, what it is that it does, and what it is that it looks like. So this is effectively my code that I have here as part of this pipeline for that. Now, if I were to look at this in DevOps, what it would actually look like is I have a project here in DevOps. Again, really minimalist here, very, very simple. But if I look at this particular code, I see in my files here are the lists of everything, the contents of actually what is out here. And here are all of the different components that is my code, basically for the pipeline and everything else that's out here. So this is what my code repository actually looks like. It's just all of these different things that I just showed you from Data Factory. Just a big JSON document with everything. All right, so when I think of the Data Factory environment, let's just say that what I want to do is I want to implement this CI/CD process, and I want to take everything from my dev environment and I want to move it into my test environment. So that's going to be kind of the process that I want to set up and configure here. So I'll show you kind of what happens when I do that, and then we'll step backwards and kind of go through what it is that we have to configure in order to do that. So let's just say, for example, that I make a change to this environment here. And by the way, before I do that, I'll show you what this exact same pipeline looks like here in my test environment. And by the way, you'll notice in my test environment, if I look in the upper left-hand corner here, instead of it being integrated with Git, it's just simply in Data Factory mode here. So from that perspective, when I look at that particular pipeline, it is exactly the same, okay? But let's just take one of these items here, and let's just look at the lookup right here. Let's say that, for example, the description for this very first lookup, and you'll notice that I don't have a retry set or an interval set really for it. I'm not really doing anything with this. Let's say that for whatever reason, I want to make a change to this particular object. So what I would do in my dev environment is I would set my object here, and let's just say that I'm going to make my retry. I'm going to say give it 10 retries here for that. If it can't get the date, it'll just iterate through 10 times for that. It's like, okay, I like that. That's a good change. I'll go ahead and make my change. But more importantly, what I'll do now that I'm ready to commit this, I'll go ahead and publish my change. That's the same impact if you're writing code as clicking on the commit. So what I'm really doing is I'm making a change. I've said I've got one pipeline that's actually going to change. Now I'm publishing that to my source control environment. And now, as you can see, what it's doing is it's generating all the templates that it needs and everything associated with that. If I look at the time right now where I'm at, it's 5:32 p.m. So if I go over here to my DevOps environment and I take a look at my releases, what I'm actually going to see here is I've got a release that has been triggered at 5:32 p.m. my time, and it's effectively going to walk through the pipeline process. Now, this pipeline here it takes a little bit of time. What it's actually doing, it's starting up the agent, and then it goes through, it downloads the templates that were created. It then takes those templates and uses the deployment environment, the scripting environment, to now deploy those templates into the Azure environment. And so that was a really quick operation. It was a small change that I made there. And so now you can see that my job is actually finished here. And if I look at my pipeline now and go back to my releases, what I see is that I've got now a green release that has moved that change that I made from dev into my test environment. Now remember, when I looked at this, there was nothing here. There was a 0 for the retry. But if I refresh my pipeline here, I always get worried with these demos because you never know if it's actually going to work. And there you have it. There you see that my change is actually deployed here into this data factory, even though my data factory here is not integrated with my source control. So it was Azure DevOps that made that change, that moved the change for me and deployed all of this into that environment. And now that I've got that, I can run whatever tests that I need to run, and then I can approve all of that, and then kick off the next phase of the pipeline to move it into the prod environment for my 3-phase setup. So that's kind of the output of what happens, but what do we have to do in order to configure this and make it actually work? So if we go back over here into the Azure DevOps environment, I take a look at this. This is the pipeline that was actually triggered whenever the check-in occurred to that publish branch inside of ADF. And so if I wanted to look at what I have to do in order to create this, and again, this is really simple just to hit the main points that I'm talking about here. But what we have really is just a stage here that looks at my source control environment and specifically looks at the ADF publish branch in my code, which is what is generated whenever I click that publish button. For that, it takes the code from my collaboration branch and moves it up into the publish branch for that. And so my stage here, the first thing that it does is it triggers based on that change, and then it sets off a series of tasks. And in this particular case, you can see here, it's triggered from that. The task is relatively straightforward. It says, keep a watch on the ADF publish branch, and whenever you have the latest from that branch, go ahead and kick off the following agent job. And then the tasks, again, are really simple here, but the agent job that it's going to kick off is very simply this template deployment. And it's going to be deployed into a specific resource group inside of Azure. And if I look at this particular job, what I see here is that the scope of this job is a resource group in Azure. And I'll talk about that here in a minute, but what we're doing is we're limiting what can be modified by this pipeline down to the resource group. My other options are a subscription, or I can actually take my entire Azure environment and make it part of this pipeline for that. In my particular case, I didn't want to do that. I just wanted it to affect a particular resource group for that. And I use my own Azure subscription for that. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to update the resource group, create or update the resource group if it's there. And then the resource group in this particular case is a resource group called DevOps test environment. The location of that resource group is in the West US, and I'm going to use the linked artifact in order to do that. And this is really what you would configure. And what you're going to do is you're going to use the template that is generated as part of that publish process. And that's where the template is that we use here. If I click on the ellipse here and browse into that, what you'll see is just what I showed you earlier from the Data Factory environment. Here's my Data Factory, and here's the template that I'm actually going to use for that. Now, there's one problem with this, and that is the fact that if you look at my Data Factory that I showed you where I made all of these changes here, the name of this Data Factory is called TM Data Factory Dev. That's what the template is going to be named whenever I publish it, and it becomes the artifact that's used in my pipeline. Now, Data Factory is one of those canonical resources in Azure that has to have a unique name in your subscription. So I can't just simply have another Data Factory called TM Data Factory Dev in a different resource group. I have to have a different name on my Data Factory. And actually, as you can see, the Data Factory over here in my test environment is named TM Data Factory Test. Yeah, I know, very original naming for everything. But This is a really key point, because if I just left everything default when I created my pipeline here and I created this particular release, if I just left it default, what would end up happening is, well, I would overwrite my dev environment with the change that I just made, which effectively means I did nothing for that. So what I have to do is I have to make sure that I am using the appropriate parameters in my template. So because of that, one of the things that Data Factory does whenever it creates these artifacts is it creates a JSON file for all of the parameters associated with your Data Factory. And so what we do is we link that parameters file with our pipeline as well for that. So we have our template, then we have our template parameters. But again, the default for these parameters is going to be the name of your Data Factory that you're working with. So what I actually have to do is I have to override one of those parameters and give it a different name here. So the factory name happens to be the very first one here. And so you'll notice that I actually overwrite the included name, the TM factory dev, and I change it to TM factory test for that. And what that does, that one simple override right there, is what allows me to actually move data from my source control environment into my factory that's already configured with just Data Factory integration for that. Then what we do is we select our deployment mode. And this is pretty much where everybody effectively that does this the first time, where they fall down. This is where it kind of causes some of the initial issues, right? That. So this deployment mode right here. Now, if I choose incremental here, which is what I've got in this particular point, what it's actually going to do is it's going to look at the resource group. And I'll show you this here in depth in a little bit. But it's going to look at this resource group right here, this DevOps test env resource group. And it's going to look to see, is there a data factory called, and then since we overrode the parameter, TM data factory test. If there is, don't do anything. If there's not, well, maybe I better create it, you know, from that perspective. Is there a data set, you know, so forth and so on, all of the other artifacts that are part of my template there. Generally speaking, that's what we want. We don't want our data factory environment, whenever we deploy it, to wipe out resources that might be there. Well, one of the mistakes that people make kind of at the very beginning here is they'll look at this and say, well, you know, I really don't want anything out there. I want to overwrite what I've got and not worry about making incremental changes. So I'm just going to go ahead and do a complete overwrite. That's fine. But the one thing that you have to understand is that if you have resources in your resource group that are not defined in your deployment template, and by the way, Data Factory deployment templates only know about Data Factory things, then what that means is it's going to completely wipe out those resources in that resource group. One of my customers had, I would say close to a petabyte worth of data in a data lake. And that data lake was a destination for one of their DevOps deployments. And they were looking at this and said, oh, this complete might be good for us. And they did a complete deployment to that particular resource group. And the data lake configuration wasn't part of their deployment in Data Factory. And therefore, Azure DevOps said, ooh, look, a clean environment, and just deleted almost a petabyte worth of data. Obviously, you can imagine the screams of horror that came back from that. It was a harsh lesson to learn with respect to this right here when it comes to complete versus incremental. The point being, if the only thing in your resource group is data factory related, then that's okay. You can use a complete deployment. Otherwise, just use your incremental here. And we'll talk about that in the best practices and everything as we go along here. And I've been doing this a long time. I've been working with Data Factory basically forever with that. As part of setting up this environment today for this demo, I was catching some screenshots and hit my complete here and forgot that I had done it. I got sidetracked and I clicked on save and moved on, ran my deployment, and then wondered how come I didn't have any data factories anymore, because it literally wiped out a ton of stuff that I had in that particular resource group that I was working with. It was one of those things like, oh, well, I guess maybe I learned a lesson here. The point that I'm making is this is a really critical piece here in all of this. So keep that on incremental, we save that, and then once we've done that, we can now go ahead and create our release if we want to, or we can just let the trigger go ahead and create that release. But that's really kind of the only thing I needed to do here was set up for the agent job, and then this task, and I'll just kind of really quickly show you what you would have done to create this page that I'm showing you here. You just go here on your agent job, you add a task, and you search for the ARM. It is an ARM template deployment. You add that as a task, and then you fill out basically the things that you need to fill out for that. So this is basically what I just showed you, but you know, going through, you just fill out from your particular environment here. So I'm not going to worry about go ahead and finishing that off for that. All right, so I've shown you the data factory. I've shown you the integration with the DevOps Get, and I've shown you the release pipeline and sort of how it works and how you configure it from that perspective. So let's go ahead and talk a little bit about some of the best practices that we have associated with this. And for that, I'm going to kind of go back to the pipeline here, or I'm sorry, the presentation, and talk about a couple of things. First of all, you'll notice that everything that moves as part of the pipeline is sort of a self-contained unit. Remember that JSON script that I showed you? Well, that defines everything for your pipeline, including all of the connections that you need for your data objects. Now, a lot of times what people will do is they will put the username and password necessary to connect to a database environment or a data environment for that. That's not something that you want to expose as part of your script for that, because it effectively flows through everything that you're doing. So whenever you're talking about connection strings and passwords, make sure you put them in Azure Key Vault. And then if you're going to do that, one of the first tasks that you would create in your agent job would be a Key Vault task to go and extract those secrets that you need. Git is smart enough that it won't allow you to save passwords for a database, so you would have to do something like this in order to do that. Another way, though, if you're working in the Microsoft ecosystem and you don't really want to mess with passwords or anything like that, is you can actually use your service principal environment for everything. So, for example, here I have in my dev data factory, let's just say, for example, I have some data sets, and one of those data sets happens to be a Azure SQL Database. And so if I look at that and I open up the connection for that, notice how whenever I set the connection to this database, I specify the server name, but from an authentication perspective, I tell it that I'm going to use managed identity. And the managed identity that I'm going to use is going to be the name of my data factory. One of the really cool things about the way Azure Data Factory works with respect to Azure Active Directory is that when you create a data factory, you also create effectively a service account for that data factory that is in your, it is basically a user in your Azure Active Directory that can be used to grant access to other resources. So see here in this particular case, I have a managed identity that's named the same as my data factory. So what I can do from a database perspective is I can go over to, whatever database, tool that you use to connect to your database. I happen to like Management Studio for this. And then you can create a contained user in the database. And in this case, I just say create user, the name of my data factory from external provider. And what that does is it creates a contained database user in the database. And then now we're talking best practices here. And what I'm doing is you can actually see the second line here on your screen. I'm altering the DB owner role and I'm adding the data factory as a member of the database owner. That basically means that everything in data factory can affect anything in my database. Now, because this database is only used by this data factory, this is exactly what you want to do. You just want to make it a DB owner, and it has the ability, anything that you want to do, create new objects, drop objects, add data, delete data, anything along those lines, you can do that. If you're working with a larger database, you're only part of a schema, something like that, you would create an appropriate role that would have the rights for just the things that you're going to connect to in that particular case. But what these two commands allow me to do in my database is it now gives the data factory full control over everything that's happening in that particular environment. So that's kind of either use Key Vault or use your service credentials. The only person that should ever be allowed to directly publish the data is the owner of that particular project. Generally speaking, what we do is we require everybody to create a pull request, and that pull request go through peer review before it's ever allowed to be published into that environment. So all your team members have read access to the factory. And then people that publish are, again, I kind of said this, but are only the owners, of that particular project. And what you do is you basically create a role inside of Azure Active Directory, and you grant that role data factory contributor access, and then you put people that are going to have the ability to publish in that role. Everybody else is forced to create that pull request that I showed you from the data factory environment there. So that's really kind of our best practices from that perspective. And then I talked about this at length at the beginning, but from a CI/CD, continuous integration, continuous delivery perspective, every project has its own data factory and every environment has its own data factory. Yes, for large scale deployments, large enterprises, that can be a lot of data factories and it can be a lot of management from that perspective. But in the long run, it's worth it because what you're doing is you're easily segmenting all of the projects one from another, and you don't have cross contamination in the event of particular problems for that. Resource names. In the modern cloud world, it's relatively easy to forget that some tools are not very friendly when it comes to naming your objects. So you want to make sure that you don't use spaces in your names. Use camel casing or underscores or some other thing, but not spaces for your names. Now, if it's all modern cloud stuff, it really doesn't matter from that perspective, but it's just a good habit to be in. If you're dealing with legacy tools at any point or something like that, it's just much easier to not have to fight that battle down the road. Just kind of start off and get into the habit of not putting spaces in names for things. All right, well, we got through this with a couple of minutes till to spare for any type of QA or anything that comes up there. Again, I will make sure that everybody has access to this particular slide deck from the Reactor website, and these links are all active links. You can go through and you can see all the documentation of everything that I talked about. And then I also included a couple of external tools that help to make what I just talked about easier from an enterprise deployment perspective. One in particular, the SQL Player tool by one of our SQL MVPs. Really good stuff, really good tools to take a look at from that perspective. But what I hope I did here was I hope I gave everybody kind of a good idea of what it is that you have to do in order to set up this integration with Data Factory for data pipelines to kind of integrate into the CI/CD world and give you kind of an idea of the art of the possible, if you will, from that perspective. So with that, I am actually going to stop presenting on my side, turn it back to the team here, and hopefully we will have some Q&A there. So Firaz, if you're there.
Yeah, I'm here. Thank you, Ted. So first of all, thank you all for joining us, and thank you so much, Ted, for putting together such a great workshop. I just want to tell you guys, if you are not part of the Reactor community already, please do consider joining us on Meetup or directly through our Microsoft page. You can also follow us on Twitter or check our previously recorded workshops on YouTube, and I have put the link that Ted was talking about in the Q&A, so you can check it out there. Plus, if you have any feedback at all about how the event went, we'd really love to hear what you have to say about this. I also put a link there for our survey. Please use the code 12601 to make sure that it's the correct event. And other than that, again, I would like to thank you all. With the time left, please, if you have any questions, feel free to put them in. Thank you.
Apparently I bored everybody because nobody has any questions this time around.
I'm sure they're working on the things that you were giving.
All right, so I see a question here from Tony. For a startup, any guidance on building the company's data function to this level of maturity? Well, that's a very loaded question, and the direct answer is yes, we do have some guidance. And what I would actually do is I would point you to one of my colleagues, a gentleman by the name of Matthew Roach. I'll put the link here in an announcement, but his blog has a whole series of articles on data culture. And data culture is really what we're talking about building with respect to this. And so he has some really good information that will help you get started in that perspective. Okay. And so there's another question here. All pipelines managed through the ARM templates. So all of the pipelines that are not part of the dev environment. So the dev pipelines are all managed as part of your Data Factory environment and the Data Factory UI. But everything beyond that, so the test environment and the production environment, are managed through the ARM templates, yes. So Patty has a very good question. Data Factory versus Databricks, which would you actually choose? Oh, it's a great question, and the answer is going to be the dreaded "it depends" on what we're doing. So for those that aren't familiar, Databricks is a managed Spark environment, and if you're very comfortable writing code, and specifically Spark and Spark SQL, then wrangling data in your Databricks environment can be a relatively straightforward and easy thing. And because of the way that they work with collaborative notebooks and things like that, it can be very collaborative as well. However, getting that level of collaboration into a CI/CD pipeline, as I showed here, can be a bit of a challenge. It's not a straightforward process in order to do that. You can definitely do it. It's workable. It's just there's a lot of manual effort that goes into creating that pipeline. Works really nicely once it's done, but nevertheless, it can be a little bit of a challenge. So the way I kind of position all of this is I tell my customers to use Data Factory until they can't use Data Factory. In other words, until they come across a use case that's going to require them to have much more in-depth Spark interaction. And then that's where you use the Databricks environment. Keeping in mind that Databricks is fully integrated with Data Factory. As a matter of fact, data flows inside of Data Factory are implemented on Databricks. So you can always use Data Factory for most everything, and then for those things that you can't, use your Databricks environment and then plug the two together, integrate them together. All right, and here is I've posted the link to Matthew Roach's blog out there in the announcements, and I think at this point that's pretty much all the questions that we have. We're a few minutes over, so Firas, I'll send it back to you.
Again, thanks everyone for joining, and thank you, Ted, for all of that. I will wrap it up and end this now. Thanks again.
All right, thanks everyone.